Whenever Disney comes out with new seasonal treats, I'm always looking for and kind of like thinking of ways that I can transform some of them into ears. And this year for Halloween, Disney came out with a poison apple macaron at Jolly Holiday at Disneyland. I came up with a technique that I like for making macaron ears like a year and a half ago, and so I thought it would be perfect to make some poison apple macaron ears. So this video is not intended as a DIY to be able to kind of step-by-step follow things. It's more so to show the full process of what goes into creating an ear design like this, as well as, although I have made macarons before, I've never made these particular ears before, so also kind of looking at like the prototyping process and how I go about troubleshooting things, because as you'll see, things did not really go according to my initial plan with making these. I recorded like in full every single step of making these ears, and I ended up with about 5.5 hours of footage, but now keep in mind a good chunk of that is doing things that didn't work out and then having to undo them and fix them. So it doesn't normally take me like that long to make a singular pair of ears, but that's kind of representative of when I'm doing a design and coming up with something for the first time. So let's get onward into making these poison apple macaron ears. For all new ear designs, I start by looking for reference images I can use to make my template. I like this photo from all ears, so I printed it out at the size I wanted it to be, and I'm tracing and cutting out the main shape of the macaron. I'm then folding it in half so I can trace around both sides and create a more symmetrical pattern. I then trace my paper pattern onto the back of a cereal box to have a more sturdy template piece to use. This is going to be my macaron foot. I then trace around that and draw an ever so slightly smaller shape inside. This will be my macaron top and filling. Lastly, I go back to the reference image and cut out the apple stem to use as a template. I'm going to include it as part of the macaron filling. Using 2mm foam, I trace and cut out 4 of my macaron feet. Then using 6mm foam, I trace and cut out 4 of my macaron tops. Finally, using 5mm foam, I trace and cut out 2 of my macaron fillings. I found that this combination of foam thicknesses perfectly fits the width of my headband. I really wish I could make the macaron thicker to make it look more realistic, but I can't have it be thicker than my headband width. With my foam all cut out, I take a Dremel and soften and round out the top edges of my macaron tops. This takes away the harsh cut of the foam and gives it a more realistic look. After rounding out all the tops, I do the same to my 2 macaron fillings, except I sand and round out both sides. I then take my fine grit sandpaper and go around and ensure everything I did with the Dremel is nice and smooth. The foam is all prepped, so I now hot glue all of the macaron tops onto the macaron feet. I'm using high temperature hot glue to give myself a little bit of wiggle room before the glue cools and sets. And I go around the edge, making sure everything is nicely glued down. Then I'm using lightweight spackle to slightly coat the macaron shells, making sure the edges I sanded are filled in smooth and also adding a bit of texture to the foam. I also make sure to add spackle to the bottom to make that edge seamless. I do the same going around just the edges of the macaron filling. Then I go back to my macaron shells and add spackle along the edge to start sculpting the feet. I scrape off the excess spackle with the back of a paintbrush until there's just enough material for a distinct foot. Again, using the back of the paintbrush, I dot into the spackle to add texture reminiscent to a macaron foot. Once the spackle is totally dry, I use sandpaper to smooth down any of the overly lumpy spackle on the front and sides. Now we can begin painting our macaron shells. I'm using acrylic paint in a nice poison apple red. I also paint the edges of the macaron filling a green. There's no need to paint more because you'll only see the edges of them. And then I paint the apple stem a nice shimmery gold. When the first coat is dry, I paint the back edge of the macaron shells because this will be seen. And then the front gets a second coat of paint. As well as a second coat of paint on the filling. That's not quite enough coverage, so I give the macaron shell one more coat of paint. With the paint dry, I add a coat of matte varnish to all the pieces. This is pretty glossy compared to the matte acrylic paint, but it helps give it a nice finish and seal everything in. Now we can assemble the macarons. I use high temperature hot glue to glue the filling down to the bottom shell, and then I add more hot glue to glue down the top shell. And there you have your base macarons. For the poison apple drip on top, I'm first starting by making a template. I take my macaron top template, and then I'm freehand drawing the design based on my reference photo. I cut that out and I'm just going to use the paper template for ease. Now, here is where things started to go wrong, and I'm going to have to undo everything you're about to see. I used my template to trace out where the drips go on the macaron shell. Then I went in with green fabric paint and outlining and filling in all the drip areas. Now, the problem here was that this was just the absolute worst fabric paint. The bottle was so filled with endless air bubbles, the paint when dried was so sticky, and it spread and flattened out so much while still just not being a nice texture. Any other fabric paint probably would have been fine, but there was just something awful about this particular color and batch. Since there were so many air bubbles, I used a pin to try and pop the air bubbles and smooth out the fabric paint. When it dried, I hated how it looked, especially since the nose had gotten so small, so I used my template to mark where the outline should be and took an X-Acto knife to carve out the overfilled fabric paint. I decided I also wanted to fix the eyes, so I marked where those should be and carved out the extra fabric paint with an X-Acto knife. And I ended up also doing the same for the drips. To hide where I used the X-Acto knife, I put some lightweight spackle in to fill in the surface and make it flush. But then I saw that the fabric paint wasn't even adhered well, and I knew I just had to pull it off and try something else. So now I'm going back in with a lightweight spackle to smooth and even out the whole surface. I gave it a light sand before going in to paint it again, except I grabbed the wrong red color, so I had to remember the correct red shade I used. With that painted, I could see the surface still wasn't too great, so I went back in with some lightweight spackle. While that dried, I decided I was going to use 2mm foam to make the poison apple drips, so I traced out 2 of my templates and cut those out. I then might use my Dremel to go around and soften the edges of the foam. Then I lightly spread lightweight spackle to cover the foam texture. Back to the macaron shells, I gave them 1, 2, and 3 coats of paint, and then went over the top again with a matte varnish. With the foam drips, I lightly sanded down the spackle, and then I went over everything with green acrylic paint. Those needed a second and a third coat of paint, and then I finished them off with a matte varnish. Then I used E6000 to glue the drips onto the macaron shells. E6000 will give me more wiggle room and time to make sure it's aligned properly compared to hot glue. In retrospect, I should have done this before gluing everything together, but the drips just ended up looking a little bit flat, so I went in with 2 coats of a green shimmer paint to give it a little bit more dimension. The macarons are finally done, so it's now on to making the headband. I have this black fabric that I'll be using for the headband. Lately, for all my hand-sewn ears, I've been making fully sewn headbands, but for this I'm doing the traditional glued method since the ears will be glued on and I don't want any movement or wiggle with the headband cover. I've shown this headband making process in many videos before, and the inside gets lined with black braid trim. I then measure and mark the center of the headband, and then mark 4 centimeters down on each side where the ears will be attached. Finally, we can glue on the macarons. I put E6000 on the shell edges and then high temp hot glue on the center filling, and then place where marked. Now, I originally wasn't planning on making a bow, but these ears just looked really incomplete without one. I'm making a smaller bow than normal, about 25 by 18 centimeters, so that it doesn't block too much of the poison apple design. This is my standard bow making process that I've shown many times before. We can now finally glue the bow onto the headband, and our poison apple macarons are complete. So as you can see, there's always lots of trial and error when prototyping a new design, but I'm really happy with how the final product turned out. And there you go, that's the full look into what it takes to creating a pair of ears like this. The macarons are definitely kind of flat, but again, I really can't and don't want to make them wider than the headband itself. So I could definitely make an even more realistic macaron if it didn't have to be adhere to a headband in terms of ears. But you can still definitely tell what they're supposed to be, and I'm overall really happy with the end result. Now, we didn't go to Disneyland Park for the Halloween season, so I have not been able to see the real-life version of this treat, but eventually I'll find a way to see one of my macaron ears with the actual macaron. even though I'll say I'm not the biggest fan of macarons. I definitely enjoy macaroons more. But I hope that everyone has a happy and fun Halloween, and thanks for watching!